Imagine uncovering the tomb of, like, the most powerful man on Earth.
Right, a true global conqueror.
Yeah, exactly. A guy who swallowed entire empires whole, who commanded wealth and labor on a scale that is honestly difficult for us to even comprehend today.
Oh, absolutely. The logistics alone are mind-boggling.
Right. So you would logically expect to find an architectural marvel that practically blocks out the sun, you know?
Yeah, something truly overwhelming.
Like a towering pyramid made of solid gold, perhaps? Or, I don't know, a colossal statue standing over a harbor?
Something that just screams across the desert to anyone who will listen, look at me in despair.
Yes. But instead, you walk into this quiet, sun-bleached field, and you find a simple, unadorned stone box.
It's quite the contrast.
It really is. Welcome to the Deep Dive. I am so thrilled you're joining us today because our mission is to open a truly fascinating dossier.
It's titled Decoding the King of Kings.
Right, an antiquarian tour of Cyrus the Great's monuments at Pasargadae. And we aren't just looking at a dry list of broken rocks here.
No, not at all.
We are examining this incredible collection of curated excerpts, intricate 19th century archaeological lithographs, and epigraphic analyses.
And together they reveal something incredible.
Yeah, they show how a single historical figure was recorded, remembered, and essentially mythologized across 3 entirely different civilizations.
It really is a profound exploration of how history is actively constructed.
Oh, for sure.
Because we often think of history as something, perfectly preserved in amber, like it's just waiting to be dusted
Kind of a
off.
fossil or something.
Exactly. But the reality is that history is built piece by piece. And not just by the people who lived it, but by the people who dug it up centuries later.
The ones who tried to make sense of all those fragments.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Please, lay it on us.
Well, the ruins of Pasargadae, the capital that Cyrus the Great built, they sat in relative silence for millennia on the Iranian plateau.
Just sitting there in the sun.
Yeah. They were essentially unreadable to the Western world. They were just these strange, imposing stones.
Untranslatable.
Exactly. It wasn't until these intrepid 19th century scholars arrived, sketching and debating and painstakingly translating, that they unlocked what our sources call a multilingual legacy.
I love that term, multilingual legacy. But to really understand this, I feel like we have to set the scene for you listening.
We do. You have to imagine the grueling physical reality for a 19th century European explorer just trying to reach Pasargadae.
Because this was not like a quick flight and an air-conditioned bus tour.
Oh, far from it. This involved months of treacherous overland travel. They were battling extreme heat, disease,
High political instability.
all of that. And they were carrying heavy surveying equipment, massive sketch pads, and frankly, the immense weight of their own classical educations.
Right. They brought all their baggage with them, literally and intellectually.
Yeah, they arrived in a landscape that was just, sun-scorched Persian ruins, wind-blowing sand across limestone.
And they brought the mentality of a dusty, wood-paneled 19th century library with them.
With the rolled-up maps and the inkwells.
Exactly.
So we are standing at the intersection of those two worlds today.
And the reason this matters to you, tuning into this deep dive right now, is that we live in a world absolutely overflowing with conflicting information.
It's everywhere.
Every single day, we are bombarded with different versions of the truth. It all depends on who is telling the story, right?
What their specific angle is, yes.
So looking at how these 19th century scholars synthesized physical evidence with multiple cultural myths.
How they piece together a truth from fragments of stone and whispers of ancient texts.
Right. It teaches us a fundamental skill. It teaches us how to evaluate complex, multi-layered truths.
The dossier actually calls this the anatomy of a legacy.
The anatomy of a legacy.
It's progression. So we are going to move from the undeniable physical reality of the monuments down to the definitive translated voice of the king himself.
And finally, to how that voice echoed out into global memory.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we have to start with the physical reality.
We do. Before anyone could read the words of the king,
Before they could debate the philosophy of his empire.
they were confronted by the actual tangible stones of Pasargadae.
And the sheer physical structure of Cyrus's tomb actively defied everything those early explorers expected to find.
It was the absolute definition of an expectation gap.
An expectation gap. I like that.
It was a profound silence where they expected a roar. The centerpiece of this physical reality is known in the source documents as the Sepulchrum Syri.
The tomb of Cyrus.
Right. And when those early antiquarians finally stood before it, after all those arduous journeys we talked about, they were utterly baffled by what they saw.
Let's paint the picture for the listener based on the dossier, because they find this stark, monumental design.
Very stark.
It features what the text calls a 6-tiered stepped plinth.
To visualize that, you have to imagine 6 massive rectangular layers of heavy limestone blocks.
Just stacked on top of each other.
Exactly. Forming this giant staircase that narrows as it goes up.
And sitting right on top of that final step is the cella.
Right. And for those who might not know, the cella is basically the inner chamber of an ancient temple or tomb.
And this specific cella is remarkably simple. I mean, looking at the descriptions, it essentially looks like a small, austere stone house with a pitched roof.
Just perched right on top of this pyramid of stairs.
That's it. Now, our sources do note there were some archaeological clues hinting at something a bit more expansive around it.
Yes, the early antiquarians documented scattered, broken columns in the immediate vicinity.
Which suggests the tomb originally didn't just sit alone in the dirt. It was likely surrounded by a colonnade.
A covered walkway supported by columns, yeah.
Creating a sacred precinct. But even if you mentally rebuild that surrounding colonnade, the core structure itself,
The actual resting place of the man who ruled the known world.
exactly. It remains shocking in its structural simplicity. I mean, it's like uncovering the grave of a modern billionaire or a global conqueror and finding a completely unadorned, simple wooden box.
What's fascinating here is the stark contrast with the prevailing architectural language of the Near East at that time.
Let's talk about that contrast, because what were the other empires doing?
Well, if we look at the Mesopotamian styles of the era, so the Babylonians, the Assyrians, their monumental architecture was highly ornate,
And deeply intimidating, right?
deeply. Think of the Ishtar Gate of Babylon. It was covered in these vibrant lapis lazuli glazed bricks.
The bright blue one.
Yes, adorned with intricate reliefs of dragons and bulls.
Or think of those massive ziggurats reaching for the heavens.
Architecture designed to overwhelm the senses and make the individual feel entirely insignificant.
It was architecture designed to project absolute crushing dominance.
Precisely. And remember, Cyrus conquered those highly ornate Mesopotamian cultures.
Right, he took Babylon.
He did. He absorbed their immense wealth, their resources, and all their master artisans into his own empire.
So he had the capacity to build the largest, most extravagant ziggurat the world had ever seen.
Without a doubt. Yet he chose not to emulate them in death.
He rejected the glazed brick extravagance completely.
He chose a six-tiered, stepped plinth of unadorned, heavy stone.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because early explorers were baffled since they expected grandiose pyramids. Why would the King of Kings choose something so stark and simple?
It's a great question.
Like, does this point to a specific PR strategy by Cyrus, or is it just a completely different cultural value system?
This raises an important question, and it's actually one the antiquarians themselves wrestled with extensively.
What did they conclude?
The architectural choice seems to be deeply rooted in early Persian and potentially Zoroastrian sensibilities.
Okay, and what were those sensibilities?
Well, these belief systems emphasized purity, truth, and profound connection to the natural elements.
Earth, water, fire.
Exactly. They prioritized that over ostentatious displays of individual ego. The stone was meant to endure.
To just be a permanent fixture in the natural landscape.
Right, not necessarily to dazzle the eye with gold. It was architectural silence used as a weapon.
Architectural silence, wow.
Because when everyone else is screaming for attention, the ruler who whispers is the one projecting true, unshakable confidence.
I love that. He didn't need to prove his power with shiny objects, but this stark simplicity created a massive problem for those 19th century explorers.
It really.
Because they're standing in front of this plain stone structure. And like we said, there are no massive statues or loud inscriptions plastered all over the outside.
Nothing to clearly identify it at first glance.
And so how did they even know they were in the right place? How did they know this was Cyrus?
This is where the physical stones began to intersect with their classical education.
Ah, the dusty library books come in handy.
Exactly. As baffling as the structural simplicity was to the explorers who wanted a towering monument, it perfectly matched the historical descriptions left behind by the ancient Greeks.
Wait, really? The Greeks wrote about this specific tomb?
They did. Writers like Arrian, who chronicled the campaigns of Alexander the Great centuries before these 19th century explorers arrived. Arrian had described the tomb of Cyrus precisely as a modest, roofed structure set upon a stone base in a royal park.
So the very lack of extravagance was the proof they needed.
Yes, the physical reality of the stepped plinth and the stone cella validated the ancient Greek texts they had read back in Europe.
The expectation gap was closed not by uncovering hidden gold, but by realizing that the quiet, unassuming historical accounts were actually factually accurate.
The physical architecture proved the texts were telling the truth.
That is so cool. But the clarity of that simple tomb didn't last long, did it?
No, it did not.
Because, as our dossier points out, the austerity of the tomb is immediately contrasted by the art found just a short distance away.
A very jarring contrast.
Yeah, if the tomb was a whisper, the carvings on the surviving pillars were a very confusing shout.
And without a readable language to guide them, these early explorers tried to decipher Cyrus's entire legacy through a single enigmatic image.
Which brings us to the danger of subjective archaeology. Because when you can't read the language, you have to rely entirely on what you see.
And human beings have a very powerful tendency to see exactly what they expect to see.
Let's examine the specific artifact, because the details in the dossier are incredibly vivid. The sources introduce it as the winged guardian of Merhab.
Right, and just for context, Merhab was the local name for the area around Pasargadae.
Got it. And we are looking at what the dossier calls the Pilastrum Syri.
It's a surviving stone pillar featuring a relief carving of a figure.
But this isn't a straightforward portrait of a Persian king holding a spear, is it?
Not at all. This is a four-winged entity that is an absolute masterclass in cultural blending.
It sounds profoundly complex. Let's break down the iconography, starting from the top.
Okay, let's look at the head.
The figure is wearing a highly specific headpiece known as the hem crown.
Yes, and this is crucial. It is not indigenous to Persia.
Right. The dossier explicitly notes this is an elaborate ancient Egyptian headdress.
It is. It features 3 bundles of reeds, solar discs, and cobra motifs.
The cobras are known as the uraeus, right?
Exactly.
So I want to make sure we really understand the weight of that. Why on earth is a Persian king wearing an Egyptian crown?
Well, in the Egyptian context, the hem crown is a potent, almost aggressive symbol of divine kingship.
Okay.
It was often worn by pharaohs during times of war or coronation. The cobras represent the goddess Wadjet, protecting the ruler and basically spitting fire at his enemies.
Wow. And the sun discs.
The sun discs connect the ruler directly to Ra, the supreme solar deity.
So for Persian stonemasons to carve a meticulously accurate Egyptian crown of divine authority in the heartland of ancient Iran.
It is a massive statement of imperial reach. It is a visual declaration that Cyrus had not just conquered the physical territory of Egypt.
He had absorbed its divine authority.
And its ancient sacred power, yes, right into his own person.
So he is visually claiming the gods of his enemies. That is quite the flex.
It is, but it doesn't stop there.
Right, because the body of the figure introduces a completely different culture. The figure has 4 massive wings shown in profile.
And the sources point out these are Assyrian or Elamite wings.
Okay, so Mesopotamia again.
Yes, they borrow heavily from the protective guardian spheres, the Genii.
The ones you would see carved into the great palaces of Nineveh or Babylon to ward off evil.
Precisely. So if we connect this to the bigger picture,
You have Egyptian divine kingship resting on the shoulders of Mesopotamian protective magic.
all executed by Persian stonemasons.
It showcases a highly conscious, deliberate synthesis. He wasn't just hoarding artifacts from conquered land.
No, he was weaving their visual vocabularies together to create a new, unified imperial language that spoke to all his subjects.
A Babylonian would recognize the wings.
An Egyptian would recognize the crown.
And both would recognize the authority of the figure wearing them. It's brilliant propaganda.
It is. But here's the massive hurdle our 19th century scholars faced.
Oh, right. They are staring at this incredible multicultural carving, but they are missing the instruction manual.
The dossier calls it the missing key.
What exactly was missing?
Originally, there was an epigraphic block.
A piece of stone bearing a carved inscription.
Yes, situated right above the winged figure. But by the time these European explorers arrived, they either couldn't read the writing, or in the case of later explorers, the writing had physically broken off and vanished.
Which created an absolute vacuum of objective truth.
An academia abhors a vacuum.
Naturally. So without the ability to read the inscription and hear the monument speak for itself, these European scholars fell into fierce, highly speculative debates.
They did. Who was this figure? Was it a depiction of a local forgotten deity?
Was it a protective spirit, like a guardian angel of the ruins?
Or was it an actual portrait of King Cyrus himself, elevated to a quasi-divine status with wings and solar crowns?
And because they couldn't read the words, they had to rely entirely on sketching the image and interpreting it back in Europe.
Which is incredibly risky.
And this is where the dossier gets incredibly revealing about human nature and the fragility of historical documentation.
It gives us a fascinating side-by-side comparison.
Yes. 2 19th century lithographs. 2 different explorers drawing the exact same stone pillar at Pasargadae.
The dossier calls it two views of one stone.
On one side, we have an artist and antiquarian named Flandin, and on the other, an artist named Kerr Porter.
Comparing their sketches provides a masterclass in confirmation bias.
It really does. It completely dismantles the idea of the antiquarian as a purely objective recording device.
Like an early camera, they definitely were not.
Let's look at Flandin's drawing first. According to the source, Flandin drew this figure with pristine, highly recognizable Egyptian details on the hem crown.
Flawless details.
Yeah, every little reed bundle and cobra is sharp and perfectly articulated. He shows the wings with perfectly intact, beautiful feathers.
And most importantly,
Wait, if Flandin is drawing a cuneiform block floating in midair and perfectly intact feathers that weren't actually there, can we even trust these early antiquarians?
well, that's exactly the issue. Flandin includes the cuneiform block, the inscription, literally floating in midair above the figure in his sketch.
It sounds like they were drawing their own assumptions rather than reality.
He drew it as a complete, perfect, platonic ideal of a monument.
But then you look at Kerr Porter's drawing of the exact same pillar.
A very different approach.
Entirely. Kerr Porter depicts a heavily eroded, almost abstract shape. The beautiful Egyptian details are mushed and smoothed over by centuries of wind and rain.
He shows severe rock shearing and damage on the left wing.
And crucially, Kerr Porter's drawing completely omits the inscription block,
It's just not there.
indicating that the top of the pillar had actually broken off and fallen away by the time of his visit.
This contrast is devastatingly important.
Yeah.
Flandin wasn't drawing what was physically in front of him.
He was drawing what he believed should be there.
Based on his classical education and his desire to present a complete, coherent artifact to the academic institutions back home.
So he knew there was supposed to be an inscription. Maybe he had seen older notes or fragments scattered on the ground.
So he just drew it floating in space.
And he recognized the basic shape of an Egyptian crown, so his mind and his pencil filled in the eroded details from his own knowledge of Egyptology.
He was essentially letting his academic theories overwrite the physical reality of the stone.
He was fixing the monument on paper so it perfectly fit his hypothesis.
It's a brilliant example of confirmation bias. He wanted a pristine artifact that proved his theories about cultural exchange, so he simply drew one.
Exactly. And this highlights a core lesson the dossier wants us to grasp. Subjective observation of physical art alone was incredibly dangerous for these early scholars.
They were trapped in an echo chamber of their own theories.
An Egyptian crown meant one thing to a scholar in Paris.
The Assyrian wings meant another to a scholar in London.
And without a voice to correct them, the stone just became a mirror reflecting their own biases.
To break out of this endless cycle of speculation, They didn't need better artists or sharper pencils.
They needed the stones to actually speak.
They desperately needed a written language to anchor the truth.
Which perfectly transitions us into the undeniable objective data. We have to look at the words themselves.
Because the discovery and the painstaking translation of the inscriptions at Pasargadae is what ultimately rescued this site from the realm of romantic myth.
And grounded it in definitive hard history. But before we dive into the mechanics of that translation, the dossier briefly touches on the broader Achaemenid visual language.
It's important to understand that the Persians weren't just slapping together borrowed Egyptian crowns and Assyrian wings randomly.
Right. They were developing their own highly refined, incredibly sophisticated aesthetic across the entire empire.
The sources show us these intricate floral and geometric border motifs found throughout the ruins.
And the dossier notes that these demonstrate a stylized architectural aesthetic that was deeply distinct from earlier Near Eastern cultures.
It feels much more elegant, much more focused on harmony rather than chaos.
How does it compare to, say, the Assyrian carvings we mentioned earlier?
Well, if you examine Assyrian palace reliefs, for example, they are frequently characterized by incredible visceral violence.
Lots of battles and hunting scenes, right?
Exactly. They depict the chaotic slaughter of enemy soldiers, the flaying of captives, or the brutal, muscular tension of hunting lions from chariots.
So they're deeply narrative and aggressively designed to terrify.
Terrify is the right word.
Yeah.
But the Achaemenid visual language at Pasargadae, with its repeating geometric borders, stylized rosettes, and spaced-out columns, suggests a culture deeply focused on cosmic order.
Balance and natural harmony. But it wasn't all just peaceful flowers, was it?
No, it wasn't.
The dossier highlights a very famous, slightly aggressive motif. A lion attacking a bull.
Yes, the iconic lion and bull.
So how does a lion killing a bull fit into this idea of cosmic order?
That is a wonderful detail, because even their depictions of violence were steeped in celestial mechanics, rather than mere bloodlust.
Celestial mechanics. Okay, tell me more.
The source notes this lion and bull motif is frequently interpreted by historians in two interlocking ways. First, as an astronomical symbol.
So the animals represent stars.
Constellations, yes. The lion and the bull represent specific constellations. Their clash symbolizes the transition to the Persian New Year, now Ruse,
Oh, wow.
specifically the vernal equinox. It's the exact moment when the sun, represented by the lion, overcomes the darkness of winter, represented by the bull.
So it's essentially a massive celestial calendar carved into the architecture.
Precisely. It is the visual representation of time functioning perfectly.
And what's the second interpretation?
The second interpretation is that it's a political metaphor for royal power subduing chaos.
Okay, that makes sense.
The Achaemenid king, who is aligned with divine order and truth, conquers the untamed, chaotic forces of nature.
So even when they depicted a lethal struggle, it was fundamentally orderly. It was the universe functioning exactly as it should.
Every carving was a deliberate, highly calculated message.
Which makes the actual written message, the literal words of the king, even more vital to understand.
We have to talk about the Inscriptio Mergabi.
Yes. This is the text that changed everything for the 19th century scholars. The dossier describes it as an arrangement of wedge-shaped cuneiform marks carved into the Mergab pilaster.
And for centuries, this script was entirely unreadable to anyone in the Western world.
It just looked like a random pattern of tiny triangles and intersecting lines.
It was locked door. Cuneiform is one of the oldest systems of writing in human history.
The word itself comes from Latin, right?
It does. It means wedge-shaped.
Because it was originally created by pressing a carefully shaped reed stylus into wet clay.
Or, in the case of monumental architecture at Pasargadae, painstakingly chiseling those exact wedge shapes into hard limestone.
But the knowledge of how to read the script, how to assign phonetic value to these wedges, had died out completely centuries before.
It was a completely lost language.
The dossier breaks down the deciphering of this text in a really illuminating way. It calls the process decoding the king.
And it presents it in three distinct tiers of translation.
It really gives you a sense of the agonizing, step-by-step intellectual puzzle these scholars were trying to solve.
Let's examine that process. The first tier the dossier presents is the original.
Which is just the cuneiform visual itself.
Just the raw, physical wedge marks as they appear on the stone.
And to a modern eye, or a 19th century eye, it is completely alien. It offers no phonetic clues, no familiar alphabet.
None whatsoever.
So how on earth do you look at a cluster of triangles and figure out what word it is?
It required the obsessive, grueling work of 19th century philologists.
These were scholars dedicated to the historical development of languages.
Right, they couldn't just guess. They had to look for patterns. The breakthrough for cuneiform generally involved cross-referencing.
Cross-referencing with what?
Scholars would look at later, readable texts, like Greek or Hebrew histories, that listed the names of Persian kings.
Huh.
They knew the names Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes. They then look at the unreadable cuneiform inscriptions and search for repeating clusters of wedges that might represent those specific known names.
So they were basically hunting for proper nouns.
Exactly. Once they isolated the cluster of wedges that meant Cyrus, they could start assigning phonetic values to the individual wedges.
It was like cracking a massive cryptographic code without a cipher key.
That is mind-boggling dedication. Staring at stone until the shapes finally yield a sound.
Which brings us to the second tier of the dossier's translation process, the 19th century scholar.
Once these philologists finally cracked the phonetic code of Old Persian, they translated the cuneiform into Latin.
The dossier provides the specific phrase, ego sum Cyrus rex, Achaemenides.
Yes.
Now, looking at these translation notes, the jump from raw, ancient cuneiform to Latin stands out to me. Why Latin?
It's an interesting choice.
Right. If these are French, British, and German explorers doing the work, why didn't they translate it straight into their native languages?
That is a very perceptive question, and it speaks volumes about the academic culture of the time. Latin was the lingua franca, the common bridging language of 19th century European academia.
So a scholar in Berlin could read a paper published by a scholar in London if it was written in Latin.
Exactly. But more deeply than that, by translating the ancient exotic Persian cuneiform into the language of the Roman Empire, the scholars were essentially legitimizing Cyrus.
Legitimizing him within the framework of traditional Western classical education.
Precisely. They were taking this mysterious figure from the East and placing him firmly on the same academic pedestal as Caesar or Augustus.
It was a way of signaling to the European universities, this is real, verified history, and it is worthy of our serious study.
They were wrapping the ancient Persian king in the familiar, respectable robes of European academia.
And then finally, we reach the third tier, the modern reader.
This is the translation stripped of its 19th century academic posturing and rendered into clear, direct English.
And it translates to just 4 simple words. I am Cyrus the King, an Achaemenian.
I am Cyrus the King, an Achaemenian.
It's so direct.
If we pause and think about the monumental impact of those words, for centuries, travelers, nomads, and early explorers wandered through these ruins.
They saw the winged figure, they saw the strange, stark tomb on the step plinth, and they could only wonder.
Who built this? Was it a mythical hero? Was it a forgotten local warlord?
And then, after years of grueling linguistic code breaking, the stones finally speak.
And they don't whisper a complicated myth. They make a definitive, indisputable declaration.
With just a few wedge-shaped marks, that brief sentence completely shifted the ruins of Murhab from a place of nameless antiquity into the definitively verified capital of the Persian Empire's founder.
It anchored all the swirling myths to a hard physical reality.
It did. So what does this all mean? I mean, when I look at those 4 words, my first thought is an analogy. It's essentially the ancient equivalent of a minimalist, hello, my name is sticker, just slapped onto a massive stone pillar.
That's a great way to put it.
Hello, my name is Cyrus, but the brevity actually bothers me a little.
Why is that?
We just discussed how other ancient kings, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, would carve massive, boastful walls of text into their monuments.
Endless lists of their achievements.
Exactly. They would list every single city they burned to the ground, every enemy king they blinded, every god that supposedly favored their spear.
It was paragraph after paragraph of desperate, loud propaganda.
Right. So why does Cyrus, the man who arguably conquered more territory than any of them up to that point in human history, just say, I am here?
The answer lies in understanding the true psychology of absolute power. The brevity is the ultimate demonstration of authority.
How so?
Cyrus didn't need to carve a sprawling, desperate list of his military conquests onto a pillar because he didn't need to convince anyone reading it of his power.
The environment did the talking.
The entire surrounding environment, the sprawling gardens of Pasargadae, the monumental palaces, the incredible wealth and resources flowing in from a continent-spanning empire to build these structures, was the undeniable proof.
He didn't need to hand out a resume because he owned the entire company.
Exactly. When you possess unquestionable, absolute authority, you don't need to shout your accomplishments.
The simple, quiet assertion of identity, I am Cyrus, is infinitely more intimidating.
It's much more powerful than a desperate litany of slaughtered enemies. It implies that his name alone is entirely sufficient.
It implies that anyone standing in that courtyard reading that stone already knows exactly who he is, what he has done, and what he is capable of.
It is an architectural display of supreme confidence.
I love that concept, the power of the unsaid. And that realization, the sheer historical weight of that simple name, brings us to the final, most expansive section of our dossier.
Because having established the physical artifacts, the stark tomb, the multicultural guardian,
And having explored the painstaking translation of Cyrus's own voice,
we now have to zoom out. We need to look at the ultimate thesis of these source materials.
the dossier transitions to what it calls the global memory.
Because those 4 translated words didn't just label a local ruin.
They acted as a physical anchor for sweeping, pre-existing historical narratives from entirely different civilizations.
This is where the story elevates from a fascinating archaeological puzzle into a profound lesson in global historiography.
The physical reality of Pasargadae did not exist in a vacuum.
No, as the source text points out, that brief cuneiform assertion served as the epicenter, the grounding point, for the diverse cultures that the Persian Empire had interacted with, conquered, or fought.
The dossier visualizes this dynamic brilliantly. It presents a multilingual legacy matrix.
It's essentially a massive conceptual Venn diagram that connects 3 distinct nodes.
Okay, let's break them down.
The inscription itself, the physical artifact at Pasargadae,
The Greco-Roman historians, which represents the Greek memory.
and the Judean exiles, which represents the Hebrew memory.
Let's tackle the Greek node first.
The Greek memory. This is a vital perspective because the Greeks were, for a significant portion of their history, the bitter existential rivals of the Persian Empire.
The Greco-Persian Wars. Thermopylae, Marathon, Salamis.
Legendary clashes of civilizations. Yet, despite this intense geopolitical rivalry, the Greek historical memory of Cyrus the Great is characterized by profound, almost reverent respect.
The dossier gives us some specific quotes from Hellenistic scholars to illustrate this. These historians, men like Arrian and Aristobulus, actually documented inscriptions they claimed were on the tomb when Alexander the Great visited it.
Centuries after Cyrus died, which is an incredible historical moment in itself.
Picture it. Alexander the Great, the Macedonian king who finally conquered the mighty Persian Empire, standing silently at the stark step tomb of its founder.
It was a deeply pivotal, reflective moment for Alexander. He had spent his life fighting the Persian Empire, but he viewed Cyrus not as a monster, but as the ultimate benchmark of kingship.
He deeply admired Cyrus's statecraft and his military genius.
And the quotes the Greek historians recorded are haunting.
Arrian and Aristobulus quote the tomb as saying, "Oh man, I am Cyrus. Do not grudge me my monument."
And then later geographers like Strabo, drawing on accounts from men like Socrates, record a slight variation.
Right, Strabo says, "Here I lie, Cyrus, king of kings."
The dossier notes that while the exact phrasing varies between these different Greek writers, the core thematic focus of the Greek memory remains consistent.
It is heavily focused on mortality, on the fleeting nature of legacy.
And on cementing Cyrus as the ultimate, albeit mortal, king of kings.
It's a very specific, deeply Hellenistic philosophical framing.
The Greeks are using the memory of Cyrus as a memento mori, a reminder of the inevitability of death.
They are looking at the greatest, most successful conqueror the world had ever seen, a man who commanded unimaginable wealth, lying in a relatively simple, unadorned stone tomb.
And they are projecting a philosophical lesson about the vanity of human ambition.
I conquered the known world, but in the end, all I have left is this small stone box. Do not begrudge me this tiny piece of earth.
It's a profound message intended to humble ambitious men.
Specifically intended to humble Alexander the Great as he stood there flush with victory.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's the Greek lens. Highly philosophical, deeply respectful of his achievements, but ultimately focused on his mortality and the limits of power.
But then the dossier flips the script completely and asks us to look at the Judean memory.
The Hebrew records. And here, the framing of Cyrus shifts dramatically.
He isn't just a respected mortal king, he is framed as an active savior.
He is depicted as a literal instrument of divine will intervening in history.
The dossier pulls a quote directly from the Hebrew Bible, specifically the Book of Ezra, chapter 1, verses 2 through 6.
It reads, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth."
Now, to understand the sheer weight of this, the source explains the historical context.
The Babylonian exile.
Right. The Jewish people had suffered a catastrophic trauma. The Babylonian Empire had conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the sacred temple, uprooted the population, and forced them into exile in Babylon.
Decades later, Cyrus conquers Babylon.
And instead of enslaving the Jewish people further, or demanding they assimilate into Persian culture, he issues an unprecedented decree.
He allows them to return to Jerusalem and actively commands the rebuilding of their temple.
In the Judean historical and theological narrative, this political act is so unprecedented, so merciful and constructive, compared to the standard, brutal practices of ancient warfare and deportation.
That Cyrus is elevated far beyond the status of a mere political liberator.
The texts frame him as being anointed by their God, actively chosen to fulfill a divine cosmic mandate.
He is referred to as a shepherd, an anointed one, a Messiah figure, working directly on behalf of the God of Israel.
Despite the fact that Cyrus himself was Persian and worshipped different deities.
And this brings all these incredible threads together at what the dossier calls the convergence of stone and myth.
Pasargadae, it turns out, isn't just a collection of ancient limestone blocks sitting in a field.
The tomb of Cyrus is the physical epicenter, where three massive, distinct versions of reality violently collide and anchor each other.
You have the builder's mark, the cold, hard, objective, old Persian cuneiform declaring simple identity. I am Cyrus.
You have the conqueror's respect, the Greek philosophical memory projecting the ultimate lesson of the mortal king.
And you have the exile's salvation, the Hebrew theological record of a divine liberator.
What's fascinating here is, from a purely historical perspective, the sheer statistical improbability of this convergence.
It is incredibly rare, almost entirely unheard of in the annals of ancient history.
For one single historical figure to be universally praised by such diametrically opposed groups.
He is deeply revered by the very people his empire conquered and ruled over the Judeans.
And he is simultaneously held up as the absolute gold standard of leadership and statecraft by his empire's greatest geopolitical rivals, the Greeks.
But hold on, let's look at this critically.
Yeah, let's play devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
Are the Greeks and the Judeans actually remembering the real historical flesh and blood Cyrus?
The guy who directed the stonemasons to carve those wedge shapes?
Right. Or are they just projecting their own deep-seated cultural anxieties and theologies onto a massive, convenient, historical blank slate?
That is the big question.
Are the Greeks just using the ghost of Cyrus as a prop to teach Alexander a lesson about hubris?
And are the Judeans just using his lenient political decree to validate their own internal theological narrative of divine rescue?
Is anyone actually seeing the real Cyrus, or just a reflection of themselves?
That is the crucial, defining question of historical memory. And it is vital that we address this analytically.
Honoring the source text juxtaposition of these records without taking a stance on the underlying theology or philosophy.
The dossier does not claim that the Greek memento mori or the Judean divine mandate are objectively factually true in a literal sense.
So what does it emphasize?
What the dossier emphasizes is that Pasargadae is the physical space where these distinct, culturally biased memories validate one another's historical reality.
So it doesn't necessarily matter why the Greeks or the Judeans remembered him the way they did, or what spin they put on it.
What matters is that their wildly different texts all agree that he was real and he was there.
The Greek texts validate that a monumentally important king named Cyrus existed, commanded immense respect, and was buried in a modest step tomb at Pasargadae.
The Judean texts validate that a Persian king named Cyrus existed, conquered Babylon, and wielded unprecedented empire-shaping power over the Near East.
And the physical, undeniably real cuneiform inscription at Pasargadae validates that both the Greeks and the Judeans were writing about a real flesh-and-blood historical figure.
Not a mythological archetype invented out of thin air.
The projections, the Greek philosophy, the Judean theology, are the cultural framing.
But the intersection of those three frames points precisely to an undeniable, hard historical epicenter.
The physical stone proves that the sweeping myths were grounded in a very real guy who left a very real mark on the world.
Precisely. The 19th century antiquarians who endured the desert heat stared at the eroded pillars and finally deciphered those four words didn't just translate a rock.
They provided the heavy physical anchor that kept those massive, multicultural historical narratives from drifting away into the realm of pure, unverified mythology.
That is an incredible realization. It completely changes how you look at a quiet pile of ancient stones.
Let's try to synthesize this incredible journey we've been on, drawing all the threads of the Decoding the King of Kings dossier together.
We started our journey confronting a confounding physical reality.
A stark, unadorned stone tomb sitting on a heavy stepped plinth.
A structure that completely defied the Western world's expectations of what imperial grandeur should look like.
Proving that true power often speaks in whispers rather than shouts.
From that architectural silence, we move to the confusing, highly subjective 19th century drawings of a four-winged guardian wearing an Egyptian crown.
Flandin drawing his pristine floating inscriptions, and Kerr Porter drawing the harsh, eroded reality.
Exactly. That contrast provided a stark lesson in confirmation bias.
Proving that without a readable language, archaeology often becomes a mirror simply reflecting the scholar's own assumptions.
But then, we drill down to the objective truth. The agonizing decipherment of four wedge-shaped words of Old Persian cuneiform.
I am Cyrus the King, an Achaemenian.
And those four simple words acted as the master key.
They finally unlocked and anchored the overlapping global memories of three distinct ancient civilizations.
The Persian assertion of physical power, the Greek philosophical meditation on legacy, and the Judean gratitude for liberation.
And to connect all of this ancient history directly back to you, the listener, navigating your own life right now.
In an era of constant, overwhelming information overload.
Where every single news story, historical event, and social media feed comes at you with a completely different angle and a different bias.
The 19th century antiquarians who sketched these stones actually teach us a vital, practical lesson.
They teach us that true understanding requires the discipline to look through multiple lenses.
A single source, even a hard, carved stone sitting right in front of your face, is never the entire story.
To even begin to see the full three-dimensional picture of history or of current events, you need the Persian voice, you need the Greek memory, and you need the Judean echo.
If you only look at the physical stone, you miss the vast human impact.
If you only read the cultural myths, you lose the grounding reality.
You absolutely must find the convergence.
Well said. Thank you all so much for joining us on this deep dive, for taking this antiquarian tour of Pasargadae with us.
It's been fascinating.
But before we go, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own, building on everything we've uncovered today.
Okay.
We've seen that Cyrus the Great's legacy was so vast, so incredibly impactful on the human timeline, that it required the languages, the philosophies, and the theologies of three completely different, often opposing ancient cultures to even begin to capture who he was.
Right.
It makes you wonder, if a leader from our modern era, someone who shapes global politics and culture today, were to leave behind a single stark monument,
Maybe a massive digital archive or a sheer concrete monolith.
what conflicting multicultural languages or historical narratives would historians 2,500 years from now need to piece together to figure out who we really were?
It is a truly daunting thought. When the dust of our civilization settles, will our collective legacy be a deafening roar of confusion or a decipherable silence?
Because as we've learned today, sometimes the most enduring, powerful legacy isn't a massive pyramid blocking out the sun. Sometimes it's just a simple stone box, waiting patiently for thousands of years for the world to finally learn how to read its true name.